questions throughout the webinar, and we will get to them at the Q&A at the end. If everybody wants to just familiarize themselves with the chat box, then please let us know where you're joining us from. We are joining you guys here from a very sunny and warm London, so enjoying one of those rare hot days here. There are also a few annotation tools where during the presentation, Kathy might ask you to type in your answers. So you should see that on the left-hand side. There is a T, the letter T, and that makes it quite easy for you to be able to type text in. So if anybody wants to give that a try as well, feel free to do so. A global leadership mindset, and presenting today will be Kathy Wellings. She's the director of the London School of International Communication. Kathy has been working in the field of intercultural training and global leadership training for about 15 years now, and is very experienced, having worked in the UK, France, and Spain, and has a wide variety of experience working with managers and teams in a range of multinationals around the world. So I will pass you over to Kathy.
Thank you, Faiza, and thank you all on my behalf as well for joining this afternoon or this morning, depending where you are. Hopefully we're looking at today, and I have to confess I struggled a little bit when I started preparing the session today, because we have a very short time together and there are so many different angles and approaches and things I'd love to have been able to share with you. So it will be a fairly quick gallop, as these webinars often are, but I'd like to share a couple of different frameworks with you and hopefully give you some practical tips and ideas and things to take away as well. And it's such a popular topic, as well as the other thing, you open your LinkedIn page and the first thing you see are 3 or 4 articles about leadership. And I think, it's popular for a lot of obvious reasons. Organizations need strong leadership, that's a given. But I think what I've realized in the last few years is that many large organizations are reporting a real critical gap in their leadership pipeline. They invest a lot of money in executive education, but somehow they don't have the right people in the right places. So I think, it is a critical topic today. And I think also on an individual level, often aspiring or new leaders perhaps don't get the right training and development early enough, or they don't get the right approach to their needs. So those are some of the things that we'll be touching on today. But before I share the objectives with you, I'm just going to ask you to vote in a very simple poll. So the question is a very easy one. Leadership requires a universal skill set. If you're a good leader at home, you can expect to be a good leader anywhere. Is this true or false? What do people think? It's now 30% would agree and 70% would disagree. And if anyone wants to comment a little bit further in the chat, feel free. But I think it's true. I would put myself on the fence. It's true, but it's not true. Yes, a lot of the skills are universal. We need certain things to be a leader wherever we are, but we also need more of those things when we're working in the complex world of international negotiations, multicultural teams, and so on. And perhaps there are also some other skills that we need on top of the ones we need to be a domestic leader, and that's one of the things that we will talk about today. So just to share my objectives with you very quickly, 3 things I hope to cover off. So we'll look a bit more about how those styles and expectations perhaps do differ in different cultural contexts. Look at the qualities we need to be a successful global leader, and then hopefully have some time to think about you and your organization and what you can actually do. Thank you, Mike. Look at a couple of pointers. Different organizations will have a number of things in place to find and to develop the leaders they want to bring forward to lead their international organizations. And I just wondered what you think about the things that I've got up on the screen there. So is it necessary to be a good global leader to speak at least 2 languages? Is it important that you've been educated overseas or lived and worked overseas? Is it something innate that you're born with? You're either born a good leader or you're not. or perhaps it's important to have been to, an international business school. So what I'd like you to do is take the drawing pen or the text icon and just put a tick or a cross if you agree or disagree that these things are important, but they're not necessary enough on their own. You can speak 2 languages, or 3 or 5, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to succeed internationally. There are other things you need to know as well as the linguistic element. It's a great start, but it's not enough. Having that international experience, again, that's fantastic, as long as A, you've had the right international experience, and B, you've had those skills to perhaps distill and apply that experience to your leadership context. So a lot of skills that are coming up around having an open mind, empathy, collaborative skills. But I think these are all part and parcel of what we call having a global mindset, which is really the theme that we're talking about today. So cultural understanding, lovely, all these things really come together to give us this global mindset. You might have heard people talk as well about things like cultural intelligence, intercultural competence, and they're very similar terms really to mean this kind of toolkit of different skills, personal traits and abilities that help us to lead in a global context. So really, let's just, before we do anything else, let's have a look at a couple of images actually. So you might think, well, what on earth have fish got to do with leadership? And you may possibly have seen these pictures before, but perhaps you can comment on how the green fish on the left is a different kind of leader from the big fish in the middle. People say before, the one in the middle is bringing everyone together, he's collaborative, but you see him as center of attention. The green fish on the left, he could be at the front leading everyone forward behind him, or he could be blocking the way so other people can't progress and develop. So again, different styles, but also different perceptions of different styles. And this is what we need to understand when we start to develop this idea of a global mindset. So just taking it a little step further, I actually went back to the dictionary because I think it is very hard to pin down what we mean by leadership. And I won't read these out for you, but you can see there's different perceptions, even in the English language. Now, I think that old idea of command and control is disappearing now, but you've still got that idea in the middle of authority. But often it's something about guiding, directing, leading the way. And then what I found really interesting is when you have a think about how leadership is conveyed in other cultures and other languages. And obviously these aren't exact translations. Often, in fact, in other languages, the anglicized leader word is used. I know certainly in Latin languages, it's often leader or leadership even, rather than a direct translation. I mean, think about the culture in the Arab world, very hierarchical, a lot of focus on seniority, and we have this words like sheikh, which really can imply the wisdom, the age, the maturity, and the respect that commands. In India, we have this term guru. I know it's not quite a leader, but again, that idea of being the expert, the teacher, the guide in an organization, and so on. So we've got the French idea of direction, almost like conducting an orchestra, showing the way, leading by example. I can't go into too much detail on the Russian. My Russian isn't the best. I think we may have somebody in the room today from Russia who can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this term is much more about the idea of management rather than leadership. And I read an interesting article recently that talked about a study where a large Russian organization had actually tried to introduce a more kind of charismatic, participative style of leadership. And it went very badly because the expectation there was for a much more leading from the front, leading by doing kind of style. So what we think is the best way of leading isn't always appropriate in other parts of the world. So I thought it would be interesting to share with you a study that was done, I think in 2004, the Globe study, if any of you are familiar with that. And what the researchers did there was they looked at what a number, I think it was something like 20,000 managers throughout the world in about 60 different countries expected from their leaders, and also what they got, and tried to identify, well, is leadership a universal set of qualities and traits and behaviours, or is it more culturally found? And again, they found that the answer was yes, but no. So yes, there are some universal qualities. So you can see them here on the screen, things like being a good decision maker. And it was interesting, the qualities that came out as universal were very much associated with things around charismatic and team-focused leadership styles. And then when they looked at the more culturally bound set of traits and attributes, they were perhaps more associated with other leadership styles, the more autonomous style, the self-protective style, or the humane style. So what does this tell us in terms of how we develop our own global leadership mindset? We need real strength in the qualities on the left, wherever we're leading, wherever we're working. But we need to be sensitive and aware of the expectations from cultures in other parts of the world that we might be expected to take on some of these other traits, depending where we're working, depending where our teams are from. You may be familiar with the work of Gert Hofstede, who's done a lot of work on cultural dimensions in the workplace and how this plays out in our workplace behaviours. In some cultures, there's a very low tolerance of uncertainty, risk-taking. So in which case, a leader that displays high levels of risk-taking perhaps would not sit so well. Whereas in cultures where the comfort with uncertainty is much lower, then obviously risk-taking is much more of an admirable trait, if you like. Some cultures are very assertive, very kind of masculine almost in their workplace behaviours, so ambition would be important. Collectivist cultures might favour a more benevolent leadership style. So again, it's being sensitive, it's being aware of these traits, not necessarily adopting them. It's something we'll talk about later in the presentation, but I think the first part is always the sensitivity to the expectations, knowing as well how you will come across. Perhaps if you're from a culture where risk-taking is admired and you're moving to a country where it's the comfort levels with risk and uncertainty are much lower. So just taking a step back, let's just have a little look at some definitions of what we mean by a global mindset. And I probably could have filled half a dozen slides with a page of definitions, but I think probably anyone who follows advertising will have come across the need to think globally and act locally, which actually has been rephrased now to think and act both globally and locally. And this is something that comes up again and again, that need to flex your own style and adapt your natural behaviours. And then perhaps underneath we've got some more academic type definitions. So Janet Bennett is an American researcher, and she talks about the cognitive, affective and behavioural skills required. Early and Ang, they've talked about the ability to adapt again, so to adapt your interactions, your communication, your behaviours. And the one that I'd really like to focus on for the next part of the presentation comes from the Thunderbird School of Global Management. They've done an awful lot of research into this concept of global mindset in the leadership space, but also working with expats and global professionals in general. And they talk about the ability to influence individuals, groups and organisations that have a different cultural perspective so that they can drive forward the company's goals. And I think you'll have seen from the other definitions, there's a theme around knowledge, behaviours and awareness. Thunderbird talks about the psychological, the intellectual and the social capital required to influence people from other cultures and other backgrounds. And that's what I'd like to just move on to talk about in a little bit more detail. So again, I'm going to give the floor to you just for a few moments. I know some of you shared a few ideas already, but if you think about what are the intellectual capacities we need to be an effective global leader, what do we need to think about psychologically, emotionally, and then what are the social or behavioural skills that we need? And I'll just give you a couple of minutes of understanding. That's obviously something we talk about a lot here. But it's more than just cultural, it's also understanding the context, if you like, the world events, current affairs, legal differences, the whole context of the countries where you're working, how business is done across cultures as well. And then there are, as well as intellectual knowledge, there are some cognitive skills I think that are very important. I'm sure everyone's heard talk of working in a VUCA environment, being able to deal with the volatility, the uncertainty, the complexity, ambiguity of the current working environment. So having the skills to manage that complexity and the analytical skills. Then when it comes to psychological, you need to be quite confident to deal with people from different backgrounds. You need the energy to drive things forward, comfort with uncertainty again, a passion and enthusiasm for diversity and difference. Some people just aren't particularly interested. So that might mean, going back to our original question, you can be a great leader at home, but if you're applying your leadership skills across cultures, you do need to be interested in what that means. And a willingness to take risks and step outside your comfort zone. So you can see there's quite a theme here around uncertainty, risk, ambiguity. And then finally, the social, the behavioural skills. So I think a couple of people mentioned empathy, being curious, asking questions, having a strong network. There's a whole raft of communication skills, but I would say out of everything we talk about when it comes to cross-cultural communication, listening and listening actively is probably one of the most important elements. A willingness to collaborate, we saw that I think earlier, and being able to integrate different perspectives. So if you run an international team, can you make the individual parts of that team as a whole better than it would be working separately? So are you an integrator? Can you bring diversity into something positive? So what I'd like to do is just go through each of those three in a little bit more detail, starting with the intellectual or the knowledge. Obviously, some of the intellectual skills are more around cognitive skills, but here just focusing on, some of the knowledge that we need to develop when we're working or when we're leading internationally. So obviously cultural knowledge is very much what we do here at LSIC. So looking at the underlying values of a different culture, looking at how that translates into local norms, behaviours in the workplace, and understanding how to interpret those behaviours. Then we have what I mentioned before, the more contextual knowledge, either on the world stage or of the specific region or country that you're working in. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Disney case study when they set up Euro Disney in Paris in the early 1990s. I think it was a textbook case study of what not to do when setting up a business in a new market. And one of the things that comes out if you read about what happened is that the US headquarters had no idea of the power of the trade unions in Paris, in France, and completely underestimated what they needed to do to negotiate and appease the unions. And they had a lot of problems because they hadn't done their research in terms of understanding the politics, the legalities, and so on. And then the third thing is really around the business savvy that you need to understand that business isn't always done in the same way in different parts of the world. So that could be around things like bribery and corruption. It could be around business etiquette, excuse me, how you work with interpreters, all sorts of kind of practical things rather than the kind of behavioural and normative stuff around the culture. And And I guess a question perhaps I'll open out to you is how do you, we're talking about developing a global mindset, how do you develop this knowledge? What can you do if you're going into a new market or you're taking on a leadership role for the first time? How do you develop your intellectual capacity? How do you get this knowledge that you need to be successful? Any thoughts from you, any ideas? Observation, I think that's really important. Thank you, Dirk, particularly on the cultural side. Um, just listening and looking. It seems really obvious, but I think if people did this more, we'd have a lot less conflict. Awareness, okay. I mean, I think while people are typing, I think my advice would be don't be afraid to take advice. Go to the experts. If you need legal advice, find a legal expert in country. Find partners who can give you the knowledge. Come to people like us, of course, for the intercultural side of things, but bring in the experts you need. Do your research up front. But yes, there's a lot you can do yourselves in terms of observation, being curious, asking questions. Absolutely, there's no such thing as a bad question. But just perhaps a little bit more, obviously this is our particular field of expertise is around the cultural piece. So just questions that you might want to ask yourself if you're leading or managing in a new environment for the first time. How do you build your credibility? It's not always the same. I think it's an important component of being a good leader, but in some cultures it's about being very assertive, being almost autocratic. In others, it's about rolling your sleeves up and getting involved. So you need to know how people are going to take you seriously when you arrive. How do you develop trust? Again, is it purely around reliability and doing what you've said you do? Or is there something deeper involved in trust in the culture you're working in? Do you need to be hands-on as a leader, or are you expected to direct from above? Should you show your expertise, or like it is in this country here in the UK, it's much more normal that a manager is a generalist. You don't need to be an expert in every discipline. How do you give feedback? In some cultures, there's an expectation that the leader gives praise, singles people out perhaps. I had a very interesting case study a few years back where an American organization was working in China, and they set up an employee recognition scheme where they named the employee of the month every month. And it went very badly because the local workforce didn't like to be singled out, and they wanted to be recognized as a group rather than an individual. So all these things are really important that you consider and you research, or you find out, or you observe before perhaps leaping into action. So I think, in terms of thinking about how we develop our own global leadership mindset, this area is perhaps the hardest for us to develop. And I think for me, this is a combination of self-awareness and self-analysis, but also the emotional strength. So things like resilience, dealing with stress, but also being able to learn from our mistakes, being aware of the judgments we make, knowing how we come across. And while it's quite hard to develop these skills, we can. I'm sure in many of your organizations you use one or other of the many psychometric tools that are out there, so you can start to identify your own strengths and areas for development. There's a lot of good work that can be done in coaching programs, training programs. And I think also, the pictures on the right-hand side are a little bit tongue-in-cheek. I think there's an awful lot of over-talk these days about mindfulness and meditation in the workplace, but they are very, very good tools. And giving yourself the time and space to step away and reflect are also very important ways of developing perhaps this psychological element of the global mindset. So just moving on to the final area of this Thunderbird work, which is around the social capital we need. And this is much more related perhaps to the behaviours that we need to develop to be a successful global leader. And I've just divided it into 4 key areas. The first is around the interpersonal skills, so how you build relationships with the people you're working with. So there's a piece around how engaging, how inspiring you are, but also the impact you create from your communication. And then the need, this is kind of the implicit side of how you communicate, the ability to tune in, to know what other people are thinking, to read what's not being said as well as what is being said. So going beyond the words in the communication. How you build trust, how you collaborate with people, and again, knowing how to flex those skills so you're adapting to the local culture, knowing what individuals and cultural groups need to trust you. And then I think this has come up from almost the beginning of the presentation, the need to be flexible. So can you adapt your natural leadership style? Can you lean in to the local style so that you can pull people in and bring them with you on the journey? But then to complement that, you also need a sense of drive, a sense of direction. You need to be able to push the team forward. You need that clarity, that direction towards the organisational goals. So this is kind of the next framework really that I'd like to talk a little bit about, is this push-pull tension that we talk about a lot in the training programs that we run here. So I'm going to actually ask you a little question again. So the scenario is new team manager is running a new global team, a project for the first time. Does he need to take on more of a, or she, sorry, that's a terrible mistake, take on more of a push style or more of a pull style? What do we think? Why they voted push or why they voted pull in the chat function? I'd be curious to know why. And I think obviously this depends on the context, and that's the challenge of working internationally, that there is never a one size fits all. It always depends on not only the cultural, the local context, but also the individuals that we're working with. But I would say in this context, when you've got a very global team, people from all 4 corners of the world sitting on their laptops, joining virtual meetings once a week, in the very early stages, I would recommend a pull style, spending that time investing in the relationships, getting to know people, understanding the different perceptions, the different expectations, ways of working, earns you results later down the road. There's been some really interesting research with global teams that shows how productivity and relationship focused teams starts out quite slow compared to more task focused teams, but then very quickly supersedes the productivity of the task only teams, because the investment they've made in getting to know each other and agreeing shared ways of working and so on means that once they get going, they become a lot more productive. If you're going into a specific market, I think it's important to, I'm just going to try the video again. I think for some people maybe it's working and others it's not, so I'll leave it open. Otherwise I'm being distracted. If you're going into a specific market, you need to have the cultural understanding to know whether a push or a pull style is more important. So for example, you're going to manage an operation in a culture which is typically more hierarchical than the culture you're used to, your own culture. Probably a push style will work better because you'll need to show that you are the boss and behave like the boss and show that you're in charge, you're leading from the front. If your natural style is more pull, Once you've gained that credibility that we talked about before, you can then ease back into a more natural pull style, get people more involved, show perhaps other ways that they could learn to work. So it really does depend on the context, which I always ask these questions where there's no right answer, just really as a way of getting people thinking. So this push and pull concept is very common in terms of communication styles, management styles, but the kind of reference I use comes from a company called World Work, who've created a number of psychometric tools focusing on international competencies for global working and global leadership. They run two tools that we use here as part of our coaching and training programs, the International Profiler and the International Preferences Indicator, which I can tell you more about another time if anyone's interested. But I really like the frameworks that they use and how this applies to very practical working situations. So I just thought I would share with you some of the competencies. The full set is 22 competencies for kind of international success. But when it comes to push and pull, we have on the pull side, you can see there on the left of the screen, things we've been talking about this afternoon already, the ability to flex your behaviour according to the context, welcoming strangers, how quickly can you build relationships with new people, unfamiliar people, do you seek out new people, do you accept different ways of doing things, different behaviours that aren't perhaps the way you would do things yourself. Can you tune in? We saw this before, didn't we? That ability to hear what's not said, to read what's not on the page, to tune into the non-verbal elements of communication. And new thinking, are you open to different ways of problem solving, different approaches that perhaps you've not considered before? And I think this is particularly important if you're in a team or a project context. And it's that thing of trying to create synergy from a very diverse team by bringing together those different perspectives and ideas. Then on the push side, probably no surprises here. We've got that focus on goals, the drive towards the organisational objectives. Then the what World Work calls the inner purpose. So do you have that inner drive, a sense of direction of knowing what you need to do and how you're going to do it? Do you have the emotional resilience, that inner toughness to deal with stressful, VUCA type situations? Spirit of adventure is one that I really like. This is around, again, coming back to that theme of risk taking, being comfortable, stepping outside of your normal comfort zone, doing things which aren't in your normal remit. And then the last one is a communication competency around really giving the why as well as the what when we're communicating. So we expose our intention, the reason why we're asking someone to do something or we're implementing a change process. So giving people the context they need to get on board and to be engaged with what you're doing or instructing. So I mean, I would love to talk to you a lot more about this, but I thought it was useful just to at least share with you a little bit of the framework. But I'm going to start to just come to a conclusion. And I think what's really important here is to think about global leadership development on both a personal level and at an organisational level. I'm not sure if some of you here in the room are responsible for developing the leaders in your organisation or whether you're here purely on a personal level, but I've got some ideas for both contexts. So just a few tips, and again, we could spend a lot of time talking about some of these practical applications, but I think if your goal is to work in a global leadership role, you do need that international exposure, but it needs to be meaningful. So you meet a lot of people that have, perhaps travelled, 10 weeks of every year they've been on a plane overseas, but it hasn't been meaningful. They've been in meeting rooms with other expat colleagues and they haven't really learnt anything about themselves or the culture from those experiences. So you need to find experience that's going to help you to develop and to grow as a leader. So you need to challenge yourself in many aspects, many directions, but also one of the things we saw on the previous framework was something called flexible judgment. Now, we all make very quick judgments about other people we meet, but when we're working, particularly when we're working internationally or in unfamiliar contexts, that ability to take a step back and question your initial judgments and assumptions, those first impressions that you make, is super important. So we know that we make the judgments, but it's being able to reevaluate and bring in new information as the relationships grow. So a lot of you have suggested this already. Ask questions. Curiosity is a fantastic skill. Do your own research. And I love this idea of finding your own cultural confidants. If you have offices in other parts of the world, try and find someone that you can chat with online or over Skype, and perhaps agree that you'll exchange information about how things work in each other's cultures. Find out some of those kind of secret hints and tips that will help you build relationships in other parts of the world where you do business. To be successful particularly as a global leader, you really need a strong network. You need to know who you can go to in different parts of the world, in different parts of your organization. So from early on in your career, start building your network. Take up opportunities to go to events, whether they're social or business breakfasts or learning and development opportunities. Make connections. Don't stick with the people you know from your own part of the business. Reach out and connect with other divisions, other nationalities, other offices, so that you have that network you can call on when perhaps you need the influence later on. And again, it's hard. We all have very busy lives, but find time to step away from the technology and have those moments where you can reflect and think about experiences. A lot of people keep journals, for example. We've talked a little bit about some of the psychometric tools that you can use. Look at your profile, think about how you want to develop and grow yourself as a leader. This is so simple, but I think we could all do with experimenting a little bit more with our communication style. The next time you're in a meeting, just try listening a little bit more, stepping back, not interrupting, speaking less, and just listening and watching a little bit more and see what you learn. And then communicate. And I think there's three elements really to your communication style when you're working internationally. So it needs to be effective, so you need that impact and engagement. Communicate often and regularly through a variety of different channels, and be sensitive to the cultures and the expectations of the people you're working with. Then very quickly at an organizational level, just a few tips and pointers. I think most large organizations are experiencing real gaps in talent. The talent pipeline is falling away, perhaps due to the demographic changes here in certainly in the Western Europe and the US. So bring in talent from other parts of the world and invest in talent so they don't leave you after a couple of years, but really create a strong talent pipeline. We've talked about this already, but make international experience part of that talent development, but make sure it's the right type of experience, and make sure people are well prepared and supported throughout their assignment, so that they actually get the development goals that they need while they're working overseas. And then if you are implementing global leadership programs, there's a myriad of models, competency frameworks, psychometric tests, frameworks, theories, methodology. So I think it's very important that you drill down to what your organization requires. Look at the markets where you're working, look at the functions you're developing, the global strategy that the organization has, and drill down to the few key skills, competencies that your people need. Otherwise, I think people become overwhelmed with the myriad of frameworks that are available. If you're going to go down the road of psychometric testing, choose one or two tools and really use them well rather than dabbling with a different toolkit every few months or so. So we need to manage the diversity within the organisation, make sure that you're mixing teams up so that people are exposed to different parts, different people from different backgrounds, and getting the opportunities that they need. And again, I guess a reference to what we do here, but if you are investing in intercultural training or leadership training, make sure, going back to the third point there on the left, make sure it's really contextualized and it's adapted for what your organization needs. I think it's such a false economy to buy off the shelf online or very sort of simple standardized intercultural training. It will give you a few hints and tips, but not the real deep contextual stuff that you probably need for it to be truly effective. And then finally, any kind of development that you're doing, it's not an hour's webinar, it's not a one-day training course. It needs to be an ongoing process. And I think it needs to have a variety of elements. So obviously talk to us about the training that we can offer, but there's the international rotations, there's internal coaching, there's psychometric testing, the observation and mentoring. So there's a whole range of things that need to be involved for a really successful global leadership program to be effective. Hello, Marcus. It's lovely to have you here, but we're almost finishing now. So thank you for joining. We are just about to wrap up. So that's kind of it for me today. I know it's been a gallop, but thank you for your participation. I think, Faiza, you're coming back to join us, and we'll have some time now if anyone has questions or comments or observations. Happy to chat.
Perfect. Well, if I can do a quick preview of some of the things that are coming up for us this summer. Our next webinar will be taking place on the 19th of July, and it'll be about giving feedback across cultures. So the presenter will be Amanda Jensen Mayer. So feel free to check out that webinar. A good way to help you to develop your tools as you're trying to give feedback and being aware of the cultural nuances as you do so. And then for those of you that might be based here in the UK or interested in coming, we do have our public courses running in the summer on Saturdays. So they are a good kind of 4-hour, short, sharp, interactive course covering a variety of topics such as email writing, working across different cultures, working with the British, and international presentation skills. So if anybody is interested or would like some more information, I think you know where to find us, so just drop us a line and let us know. Otherwise, thank you everybody for joining us and for a great session. I think there's a lot of good information and food for thought. If you have any questions afterwards, do let us know. And as Kathy mentioned, we'll be sharing the recording as well as some other materials and books and resources that you can read for developing your global leadership mindset. But thank you everybody, and we'll see you at the next one.